Chapter 6. The Vietnamese Modification. Necessity being the mother of invention, Ho Chi Minh and Vion Nguyen developed and employed the next major modification of communist insurgency doctrine. The first communist insurgents faced with defeating a powerful outside government, they developed an interesting twist on the concept of people's war. While maintaining the Maoist model of a three-phase insurgency based on the peasants, they refined the model to include an aggressive attack on the national will of their principal enemy, first France, then the United States. Ho Nguyen developed the ability to take the political war to their distant enemy's homeland and destroy his will to continue the struggle. For purposes of this study, it is vital to understand how nations as sophisticated and powerful as France and the United States could completely misunderstand the type of conflict in which they were engaged. It is clear that much as the generals of World War I did not understand that warfare had changed, first the French and then the US political and military leaders missed the changes. To illustrate how completely the United States missed the type of war we were fighting, consider Col. Harry Summers on Strategy, a critical analysis of the Vietnam War. Published in 1982, it was widely acclaimed in political, military, and academic circles as a clear, accurate strategic assessment of the U.S. Vietnamese War. In it, Summers used Clausewitzian logic to argue that the proper role for the United States in Vietnam was to act as a screen between the North Vietnamese regulars and South Vietnam. He believed that the true threat to South Vietnam was not from insurgency but from a conventional invasion. The insurgent activity simply served to distract our attention from the real threat, the North Vietnamese army. Colonel Summers backs this argument by pointing out that it was, in fact, the North Vietnamese army that finally invaded and destroyed the South. He states, "It is indicative of our strategic failure in Vietnam that almost a decade after our involvement the true nature of the Vietnam War is still in question. There are still those who would attempt to fit it into the Revolutionary War mold and who blame our defeat on our failure to implement counterinsurgency doctrine. This point of view requires an acceptance of the North Vietnamese contention that the North Vietnamese regular forces were an extension of the guerrilla effort, a point of view not borne out by the facts. Point 1. Colonel Summers was joined in this viewpoint by a number of other senior U.S. officers. Admiral U.S. Sharp, Sinpac Float 1964-68, contended that the Vietnam War was essentially a conventional war and was subject to solution by application of conventional military force. Sharp stated, "We could have forced Hanoi to give up its efforts to take over South Vietnam. But authority to use air power to this end was simply not forthcoming." 2. Agreeing with this conclusion, General R.G. Davis stated, "From the beginning, it was known that the real enemy would be those 14 NVA regular divisions plus the Viet Cong main force regiments and battalions 3. In his otherwise outstanding article comparing Vietnam to El Salvador, Lieutenant Colonel Hayden also subscribed to this theory. He wrote, "In Vietnam in 1968, following the Tet Offensive, a combined civil-military campaign plan for nation-building ultimately defeated the insurgents by 1970 and forced the North Vietnamese to conventional military tactics in 1972. It was not a barefoot guerrilla who kicked in the Saigon presidential palace gate in April 1975, but a North Vietnamese T-54 tank. It took a major North Vietnamese conventional military offensive to do what a revolutionary insurgency could not do in South Vietnam. Point 4. The common theme that comes out in all these writings and that has many proponents even today is, South Vietnam was not defeated by an insurgency but rather by the conventional forces of a foreign nation. Although the statement that we had destroyed most of the insurgents in South Vietnam is accurate, the interpretation that South Vietnam fell to a conventional, foreign invasion is not. Even more significant, the idea that concentrating on the North Vietnamese conventional power would have won the war is a gross oversimplification of the conflict, a fundamental misunderstanding of the nature of the war. Yet the idea that Vietnam fell to an invasion has great appeal, precisely because it simplifies the situation. It moves us out of the complex realm of insurgency and 4GW into the relatively orderly and easy to understand realm of conventional war. Unfortunately, if we are seduced by this idea, we fail to see the nature of the war we fought and therefore cannot learn from it. We will not see the significant contribution the Vietnamese made to 4GW. Reality. Although the conventional foreign invasion theory sounds convincing to an American reader, its fundamental flaw is that it reflects an American point of view. Viewing these events from an American point of view helps us understand what we did, but it obscures what the Vietnamese communists were doing and therefore what was really happening on the ground. In contrast, the study of the war from a Viet point of view, using Mao's model of a three-phased insurgency, clearly shows that the Second Indochina War was an insurgency brought to its planned conclusion. In the last chapter, we briefly explored how Mao developed People's War. We can now explore how Ho Chi Minh and his followers modified that three-phased approach to succeed in Vietnam. In his address to the Second National Congress of the Vietnam Workers' Party, Ho summarized the Viet Minh Revolution to date. Our party and government foresaw that our resistance war has three stages. In the first stage, all we did was to preserve and increase our main forces. In the second stage, we have actively contended with the enemy and prepared for the general counteroffensive. The third stage is the general counteroffensive. 5. Clearly, Ho is using Mao's three-phased model. Not only did he openly declare he was using Mao's model, he did so in February 1951. In his address, the war he was discussing was the First Indochina War, between the French and the Viets. The speech was made 3 years before the decisive conventional campaign of Dien Bien Phu. Even this early, Ho saw exactly how he could defeat a militarily superior enemy. Despite Ho stating exactly what his strategic approach would be, the majority of the French officers either never understood the concept or simply did not believe it could work. Those who did understand utterly failed to develop a strategy to counter it. After floundering tactically from 1945 to 1953, the French appointed General Navarre on May 28, 1953, to command the French Union forces in Indochina. At the time, the French effort was stalled and, as in all insurgencies, if the government is not succeeding, the insurgents are getting stronger. Navarre had to do something. There was never an official published program known as the Navarre Plan. However, according to various public statements made at the time of its inception, the practical meaning and purpose of the plan becomes clear. According to Navarre's own chief of cabinet, Colonel Revel, the Navarre Plan was designed to break the organized body of communist aggression by the end of the 1955 fighting season, leaving the task of mopping up the smaller guerrilla groups to the national armies of Cambodia, Laos, and Vietnam. 6. General Navarre did not understand the Maoist tactic of retreating before pressure to ensure survival of the insurgents' forces. Nor did he understand that the guerrillas were not a peripheral supporting element of the insurgents, but that during Phase 2, the guerrillas' forces are at the heart of the insurgents' strategy. In October 1953, General Giap, commander of the Vietnamese People's Army, showed that he was using Mao's admonition. Dijin, Wo Tui, when the enemy advances, we withdraw, Diju, Wo Roa, when the enemy rests, we harass. Dipai, Wo Da, when the enemy tires, we attack. Ditui, Wo Chui, when the enemy withdraws, we pursue. Where Navarre massed forces, Giap withdrew. Where Navarre held fast, Giap harassed and bled the French garrisons. Where Navarre economized forces, Giap attacked. Where French forces tried to withdraw from the highlands, Giap pursued ruthlessly, wiping out most of the detachments. By October, it became clear that the French forces were destroying neither the communist main force nor the guerrilla forces. Therefore, Navarre initiated an offensive in the south, with the stated objective of seizing a major communist base, Phu No Quan. He seemed to believe that Giap would be forced to defend this asset and the forces located there. As Bernard Fall, French author and expert on the Indochina conflict, points out, contrary to the hopes of the French, Communist General Giap did not let himself be goaded to commit the mass of his elite forces for the sake of saving one division. When Phu No Quan had become useless, the VPA forces around it merely melted again into the rice paddies and hills, and the French entered a deserted city. 7. After seizing the base area, the French could see no strategic value in retaining it, so they returned to garrison. The battered but still effective Vietnam People's Army, VPA, regiments immediately moved back into the contested space. Frustrated at their inability to come to grips with the VPA, and still erroneously thinking that they could beat an insurgent via the big battle, Navarre decided to take the fight to ground of the communists' choosing. He struck deep into communist territory with an airborne assault on Dien Bien Phu on November 20, 1953. Giap responded by attacking French outposts in the four corners of Indochina. Navarre spread his already thin forces even thinner by moving forces to the threatened areas. As Fall observed, Giap thus had fully succeeded in making Navarre progressively throw his painfully gathered mobile reserve into the four corners of Indochina in pursuit of a single battle decision that was definitely not part of the pattern of the war fought in Indochina. Yet in his New Year's message to his troops, Navarre stated, having lost all hope of winning a decisive battle in the Red River Delta, the Viet Minh disperses its forces. However, in that type of warfare, we have the advantage of being able to concentrate our forces rapidly at any essential point. A campaign begun under such conditions can but turn in our favor. 8. Once potential French reinforcements were scattered, Giap hit Dien Bien Phu hard. By May 15, 1954, Dien Bien Phu had fallen. By July 21, a ceasefire had been negotiated in Geneva, and hostilities had ceased. The French people were exhausted. Unable to see any successful conclusion to the war and concerned with the rising conflict in Algeria, they simply wanted out. The French conceded control of the northern half of Vietnam to the Viet Minh. Although jubilant at their victory, the Viet Minh obviously felt they had been cheated of what they had won on the battlefield. They were not content with leaving half the country in control of another government, even if it was nominally Vietnamese. After biding their time to see if the promised 1956 elections would be held, the Communists continued the struggle. During this period, Ho also ruthlessly put down unrest in North Vietnam. The peasants, angered at the failure to keep the promises made during the fighting, attempted to organize. Ho crushed them. After securing his rear area, Ho restated his faith in the Maoist theory he espoused as the basis for the struggle for complete unification. While addressing the Third National Congress of the Vietnam Workers' Party in 1960, he said, "Over the past 9 years, our party, implementing the line of the Second Congress, led our people's bitter, difficult, and heroic war of resistance." 9. He proudly stated that the liberated areas now serve as the firm base of the struggle for national reunification. Our nation is one, our country is one. Our people will undoubtedly overcome all difficulties and achieve national reunification and bring the North and South together. 10. Ho repeatedly stated that he would follow Mao's model right through phase 3. Even so, we don't have to take his word for it. We can compare what happened in the military and political arenas from the mid-1950s to 1975 with Mao's three-phase model. During the late 1950s, different parts of Vietnam were in different phases of the insurgency. This didn't worry Ho, because Mao had said this would be the case in virtually all insurgencies. Unless the government collapses, as did Batista's, insurgents lack the strength to simultaneously execute Phase 3 throughout the country. Instead, they must progressively take over sections of the country. For example, regular communist forces occupied North Vietnam, the Iron Triangle, and portions of the Central Highlands, which therefore represented territory at the successful conclusion of Phase 3. These areas served as the secure bases Mao declared were necessary to prosecute Phases I and II. Other provinces were heavily contested, and administration in these areas passed back and forth between insurgents and the government. Often, it was literally a matter of night and day. The government withdrew inside compounds at night, and the insurgents ruled until morning. In keeping with Mao's writings, the insurgents fought when conditions favored them, governed when they could, and withdrew when faced with superior forces. These areas fulfilled Mao's description of contested areas in Phase 2 of his model. Finally, in the government strongholds, insurgent activity was limited to covert political organization and assassinations, clearly Phase I activities. In these areas, in keeping with Mao's writings, insurgents focused on building the political base that would sustain the guerrillas when they moved to Phase 2. Just as important, they sunk those roots deep, so that the organization could survive any government actions. Therefore, despite early U.S. financial and advisory assistance to the South Vietnamese government, the insurgents were making accelerating gains during the late 1950s. In the early 60s, greater U.S. assistance and Diem's consolidation of power initially resulted in numerous communist reverses. Unfortunately, after these early successes, Diem became more and more remote from his own people. His government became more and more corrupt and dictatorial, and his tactics more and more brutal. His treatment of dissenters ensured that no one could come forward to try to correct the problems that were driving people away. As a result, the insurgents regained the initiative in the countryside. The Communists' obvious progress and Diem's alienation from his own people led to his overthrow and execution in 1963. In the turmoil following Diem's death, the Communists pushed hard nationwide. Using constant military pressure, international propaganda, and organized political agitation, they exploited divisions in the government and changed the correlation of forces strongly in their favor. Therefore, in keeping with Mao's model, they moved to dramatically expand their Phase 3 areas in early 1965. They committed major conventional forces, in an attempt to seize the highlands and cut South Vietnam in half. However, they ran smack into the newly deployed U.S. combat forces and were badly mauled. The entry of major U.S. combat forces suddenly and dramatically shifted the correlation of forces back in favor of the South Vietnamese government. Unable to stand up to U.S. forces in conventional combat, the Vietnamese were forced to abandon Phase 3 in most of the South and return to Phase 2. In areas of American concentration, they were even forced to drop back to Phase I. Mao had anticipated this possibility. He had said, "The strategic counteroffensive of the third phase will not in the initial phase assume a uniform and even pace throughout the country, but will rise in one locality and fall in another. China's task will be to take advantage of this international situation in order to attain her complete liberation and establish an independent democratic state." 11. Mao knew that enemy successes could force an insurgent to regress to an earlier phase. However, he was convinced that as long as the insurgents remained active and followed his theory, they would eventually win. With the entrance of U.S. combat forces into the war, the Communists were forced back to Phase 2 operations until the correlation of forces once again shifted in their favor. Aware of his military and economic inferiority, Ho sought to use international political maneuvering in conjunction with guerrilla warfare to bring about this change. He foresaw that the long-term course of the war was subject to change. Based on the international political situation, it is possible to examine the general situation in order to divide it into big stages, but it is not possible to cut off completely one stage from the other like cutting bread. The length of each stage depends on the changes between the enemy forces and ours, and also on the changes in the international situation, whether the general offensive will come early or late. 12. Besides being closely attuned to the international political situation's influence on the war, Ho envisioned a long war of attrition, leading to ultimate victory. As he explained to Bernard Fall in 1962, "Sir, you have studied us for 10 years, you have written about the Indochina War. It took us 8 years of bitter fighting to defeat you French in Indochina. The Americans are stronger than the French. It might perhaps take 10 years, but our heroic compatriots in the South will defeat them in the end. We shall marshal public opinion about this unjust war against the South Vietnamese." 13. He openly explained how he expected to beat the U.S. South Vietnamese alliance. He planned a war of attrition, accompanied by intensive national and international propaganda to weaken American resolve. After accurately explaining what he planned, Ho then proceeded to execute that plan. Much as he had done against the French, he spread American forces out by engaging them throughout South Vietnam. Again, as he had against the French and Mao had against the Japanese, he instructed his commanders to choose the time and place of all engagements. That way, he could control the tempo and attrition of his forces as well as those of the Allies. The attrition from 1965 to 1968 convinced the North that the time had come to shift to Phase 3, the conventional fight. We do not have access to North Vietnamese records, so we do not know if they really thought the South Vietnamese civilians would rise up or if Tet was a desperate measure because the North felt they were losing. Whichever is the truth, the long period of attrition and optimistic predictions by General Westmoreland, followed by the massive shock of Tet 68, did indeed change the correlation of forces. Although Tet drastically changed the balance of military forces in favor of the U.S. South Vietnamese, it even more decisively changed the political climate in favor of the Communists. Although Tet resulted in crippling casualties among the insurgent infrastructure, it did little or no damage to the base areas of the revolution in North Vietnam, Cambodia, Laos, and portions of South Vietnam. In contrast, the U.S. tactical victory could not reduce the terminal strategic damage caused to the political will of the United States. There has been a great deal of discussion about this apparent dichotomy between the battlefield results and the strategic outcome. Yet if you look at it from a 4GW point of view, it is the natural outcome. Remember that the struggle is primarily political, so it matches the political strength of one opponent against the political strength of the other. Our leaders had expended their political capital both domestically and internationally by repeatedly underestimating the Communists and promising early victory. In contrast, the combination of the iron control of a dictator and the repeated statements to his people that the struggle could take decades kept Ho's political capital high domestically. Internationally, Ho turned up his propaganda. To sway Westerners who were already leaning to the left, Ho portrayed the Viet Cong as a small group of freedom fighters trying to overthrow a corrupt regime. He emphasized the destruction wrought against Vietnamese civilians and villages by American firepower and large-scale operations. To undercut the support of the center and the right of the United States, Ho focused on a different message. For them, he emphasized that the corrupt Southern regime was happy to let American soldiers die for it as long as key members of the regime could get rich. And of course, the South Vietnamese government helped his campaign by living up to many of his slurs. In contrast, even post-Tet, the United States simply stuck to its pre-Tet statement that it was winning and that the South Vietnamese were a democratic government. We seem to feel that the destruction of the Qatar and the improving security situation in the South should speak for themselves. Unfortunately, the U.S. government's poor credibility made Americans reluctant to accept the same line they had been hearing since 1965. The result was the steady shift of American public opinion against the war and ever-increasing international pressure to terminate our involvement. From 1968 to 1972, the security situation in the South actually continued to improve. Although the exact reasons for the improvement are multiple, a major factor had to be the devastating casualties the insurgent Qatars took during Tet 68 throughout the South. Key leaders of the Viet Cong Qatar had revealed themselves to participate in what they believed was the final offensive and took massive casualties as a result. The combination of the attrition among the leaders and the fact that the people did not rise up to support the revolution meant that the Viet Cong never recovered in the South. Yet despite the continuing success of the Allied forces, we witnessed the irreversible erosion of U.S. political support for the war during this period. The Vietnamese achieved this remarkable coup by maintaining minimal military activity while aggressively pushing their international propaganda, which included the negotiations in Paris. they moved back into phase 2 of a Maoist insurgency. Maintaining a low level of military pressure and husbanding their strength, the Communists concentrated their effect on the international political arena to prepare the scene for another move to phase 3. With the erosion of American will, President Johnson's abdication, and the election of President Nixon on a peace with honor platform, America shifted its strategic approach to Vietnamization. Under this plan, American combat forces would be withdrawn from the country and the Vietnamese would assume responsibility for their own defense, backed by U.S. firepower and logistics support. The North Vietnamese were not able to rebuild their network in the south, despite sending large numbers of North Vietnamese to do so. Frustrated in these efforts, they could see that the withdrawal of U.S. forces presented different opportunities. The withdrawal, combined with the South Vietnamese concentration on pacification in the countryside, led the North Vietnamese to once again attempt to move to Phase 3. Seeing the dispersion of the South's military forces and the withdrawal of virtually all U.S. ground combat forces but misreading the international political situation, the Communists prematurely kicked off a major conventional offensive, the 1972 Easter Offensive. Once again, the Communists suffered enormous casualties, but this time to their regular forces. Once again, the South Vietnamese people rallied to the government and drew encouragement from their ability to stand against the North. The survival of the South Vietnamese government should have strongly encouraged the United States. Instead, once again this campaign resulted in a further decline in U.S. support for the war. The combination of continued conflict, corruption in the South Vietnamese government, and the domestic political problems of the Nixon administration completed the destruction of the American people's support for the war. Vietnamization continued at breakneck pace and, in 1975, we abandoned the Southerners to the tender mercies of their communist countrymen. Trained to rely on heavy firepower that is integral to the American way of war, the now penniless South Vietnamese army was overwhelmed when the North Vietnamese attacked during the Spring Offensive in 1975. President Ford, as an unelected president serving in the wake of a disgraced president, could not even convince Congress to provide funds and emergency resupply for the South Vietnamese. Although the South had won the pacification war, the Army of the Republic of Vietnam, ARVN, out of ammunition, spare parts, and hope was helpless to withstand the conventional forces of the North. The collapse was swift and sudden, if not predictable. The final Phase 3 offensive, the Spring Offensive of 1975, brought a communist victory in the Second Indochina War just as the campaign culminating in Dien Bien Phu represented the decisive Phase 3 success of the First Indochina War. For the third time in as many decades, Mao's approach to war had triumphed. History shows that the guerrilla war was not a separate war we won. Rather, it represented phases I and II of a classic Maoist insurgency. Although we devastated the insurgent infrastructure, the local guerrillas, and the guerrilla main force units, they fulfilled their role in the insurgency. Through their sacrifice, they changed the correlation of forces and set the stage for the final, successful Phase 3 invasion by the conventional forces of the North. The activities of Phases I and II were not a separate war but part of the continuum of the insurgency. This brief review of the Maoist theory, Ho's public statements, and the course of the Second Indochina War should make it clear that Vietnam was an insurgency that showed some marked and clever evolution from Mao's original model. The Vietnamese used 4GW to defeat two powerful overseas enemies without ever placing a soldier on their soil. In 1951, Ho publicly stated how he was going to beat the French and then did so. In 1962, Ho explained to Bernard Fall exactly how he was going to beat the Americans and then did so. In both cases, he stated he was going to employ Mao's People's War. Despite all this proof, some Americans continue to argue that the troops who seized the presidential palace on April 30, 1975, were foreign troops. Therefore, we won the insurgency but lost the war by failing to deal with the conventional forces that were the real enemy. For purposes of this study, it is essential that we destroy that myth. If we do not understand that the Vietnamese won using a variation of Mao's People's War, we cannot see it as a logical progression in 4GW. In fact, the following brief look at Vietnamese history will show that South Vietnam was not invaded by a foreign army but fell to the Phase 3 efforts of a Vietnamese insurgency. The foreign invasion. The first and most basic problem with the concept of a foreign troops destroying South Vietnam is that it looks at the problem purely from a Western point of view. The Vietnamese communists, North and South, certainly did not think of themselves as foreigners. They saw Vietnam as a single nation that had evolved over more than 2,000 years. Much of that time, the Vietnamese had endured incredible hardships fighting to eject Chinese invaders. In addition to resisting the Chinese, the Vietnamese constantly strove to subjugate neighboring peoples. Throughout the last 1,000 years, they slowly displaced a variety of peoples, primarily the Chans and the Khmers, eventually expanding to fill the area we now know as Vietnam. Vietnamese thought of their country as a single entity and continued to do so even after the French conquered it and divided it into thirds for ease of administration during the 19th century. In contrast to this long historic tradition, the Western concept of a North and South Vietnam was born in the Geneva Accords of 1954. These accords further stated that separation was to be temporary, with free elections and unification by 1956. After the accords, Ho himself said, "At present, what are the revolutionary tasks of our party? On the national level, we have not yet completed the task of a national people's democratic revolution. As for the North alone, since the restoration of peace, 1954, it has been liberated completely. In the South, we are carrying on the task, and are struggling for national unity." 14. Thus the concept that South Vietnam, an artificial entity with a short history, fell to an invasion of foreign troops is absurd from a Vietnamese point of view. Clearly, despite the continuing denials of some Americans, this was a classic insurgency. Once we accept the fact that we were defeated by an insurgency, the key question is, did the Vietnamese develop any strategic, operational, or tactical innovations that advanced 4GW? The clearest proof they did is that from Tet until 1975, the insurgents consistently lost on the battlefield, yet they won the war. Strategically, they shifted the focus from the battlefield to the political arena. The Paris peace talks provided a venue to present their arguments to the world. They could appear to be negotiating but in reality remain as intransigent and focused on victory as ever. Operationally, they tied their tactical actions to wearing down the political will of the United States. They did not seek major battles or victories but steady attrition, at their own pace, that would result in changing the correlation of forces in their favor. Tactically, they controlled the tempo, frequency, and location of most engagements. They maximized their advantages while minimizing American firepower. They even turned that firepower against America by ensuring that they fought as often as possible in areas where American supporting arms killed civilians. They did not try to hold the field at the end of the day. Thus, by Western standards, they were consistently losing the battles. This would have mattered in 3GW but is irrelevant in 4GW. Defeat and the press. The puzzling dichotomy between apparent battlefield success and long-term strategic failure led many Americans to blame the press for the fact that the Vietnamese could lose so consistently yet still win the propaganda battle. It is essential to examine that charge to see whether the press, as an independent entity, caused our defeat or if it was a combination of U.S. failure to get our message out and Vietnamese success in disseminating theirs. In other words, was the shift in opinion the result of independent outside forces or the actions of the governments involved? Essentially it was the press fault. Argument states, the United States won great military victories throughout the war, and particularly during Tet 68. It was the press that turned these victories into a political defeat. Unfortunately, this theme does not recognize that war has changed. It still subscribes to the Clausewitzian idea that destroying the enemy's army is the key to winning a war. This theme argues that Tet 68 should have been a victory in itself and a serious strategic setback for the Communists. Further, the continued U.S. and Army of the Republic of Vietnam successes against the Viet Cong and NVA should have sealed our victory rather than seen the erosion of support. Instead, according to this view, the Communists actually gained strength because of inaccurate reporting by the U.S. and international press. According to this thesis, the inaccurate reporting heavily contributed to the destruction of America's will to fight. This statement shows a fundamental misunderstanding of the evolving 4GW tactics and techniques. All military actions have value only if they contribute to the political goal of the government. The comparative body count and control of a specific geographic area is not significant. The only issue is whether the action affects the political strengths of the combatants. The Communists clearly did not expect the devastating defeat of Tet and probably did not foresee its powerful political fallout. Yet, unlike the United States, they were quick to capitalize on it. Worldwide, they hammered home Ho's recurring theme. The truth is President Johnson wants neither peace nor peace negotiations. As a matter of fact, at the very moment when he talks a lot about peace discussion, the U.S. imperialists are further expanding their war of aggression in South Vietnam, massively sending their tens of thousands of U.S. troops and extending escalation in North Vietnam. The peoples of the world have clearly seen this. That is precisely the reason why the progressive American people are actively opposing the U.S. war of aggression in Vietnam. 15. Given insurgency's political nature, Ho understood that the U.S. center of gravity was our political will. He used the impact of Tet to attack that center of gravity. He turned the battlefield defeat into a major strategic victory in his effort to change the correlation of forces in preparation for the conventional battles of Phase 3. In contrast, the U.S. government did not seem to understand that the perception of what happened in Tet was more important than what really happened. Even worse, the government had squandered its credibility with the press and, through them, with the U.S. public. According to John Lawrence, a young CBS reporter at the time. Bad information was in the military reporting system. Each stage of the reporting system was vulnerable to inaccuracy. At times, lies were deliberate. Body counts were exaggerated. Civilian dead, wounded and captured became enemy dead, wounded and captured. The numbers of weapons and supplies captured and destroyed were inflated. Territory swept was misreported. Details of combat were adjusted to look more favorable to the U.S. side. Successful enemy ambushes were not reported. Casualties from friendly fire were listed as combat dead and injured. Mistakes of all kinds were unreported. Cover UPS were commonplace. Point 16. Lawrence is not talking about the late 60s and early 70s in Vietnam. He is talking about his perception as a young reporter in 1965 and 1966. By the end of his first tour in Vietnam, he had completely lost faith in official government statements. By 1966, the official Military Assistance Command Vietnam, MACV, news conference was derisively referred to as the 5 o'clock follies. The government's credibility continued to decline from that point. Further eroding the government's credibility was the fact that General Westmoreland flew home just before Tet to reassure the American people that we were winning, that there is a light at the end of the tunnel. He completed this cheerleading tour of the United States only a month and a half before Tet. The embarrassment of being surprised and the disastrous erosion of the government's credibility prevented it from convincing the American people that Tet was really a U.S. victory. Further, the government was never able to recover its credibility with the people or the media. In reality, the press did not turn the tactical success of Tet into a strategic defeat. The inability of U.S. decision-makers to understand its political ramifications and deal with those ramifications did. Understanding how Ho made such good use of the highly inaccurate press reports on Tet is critical to understanding one of the most powerful tools of 4GW. We know the media will continue to play a critical role in all forms of war and, just as with initial military reports, initial press reports are apt not to be accurate. Even more problematic is the huge increase in the number and types of reporters who will cover any event. Much of that coverage will be unedited, live footage, with narration provided by an anchor who probably has no military experience and, as in a domestic crisis, will simply keep talking to fill airtime. Because 4GW is essentially political and we will rarely see the measure of control we had in Desert Storm, the rapid dissemination of accurate, credible information can make or break the counterinsurgents' effort. We must go beyond disgust with inaccuracy of the past and try to understand how the press relates to the future conduct of war. Summary. The thrust of this entire discussion has been to illustrate that key U.S. decision-makers never fully understood the nature of the Vietnam War. Like Colonel Summers, they saw the struggle in Clausewitzian terms and felt they could wear down the Vietnamese through sheer attrition. Because they could not conceive of the idea that we could lose until much too late, we never even focused the government on the war. The fact that we had no one above the level of colonel in Washington working on Vietnam full-time shows that we considered this a less than serious war. Unfortunately, the phrase limited war summed up our level of commitment. In contrast, the communists understood the nature of the war they were conducting. They knew the key to victory was the will of the American people. Knowing this, they developed a strategy to attack that will. They dictated the tempo, timing, number of engagements, terms of engagement, areas of operations, and final outcome. The question remains, how did this come about? Given the enormous gulf between the culture, histories, and political organizations of the antagonists, it is understandable that neither side began with a good understanding of the other. Yet, despite having started with major misconceptions about the United States and its relationship with its South Vietnamese ally, the Communists proved flexible enough to analyze the situation in light of new information, learn from their mistakes, and reorient their efforts toward our weak point, our national will. Like the Communists, the United States and South Vietnam started without a clear picture of what was necessary for victory. However, we never changed. We clearly misunderstood the Communists and struck at the periphery of their strength, their regular combat forces. Not understanding Mao's insurgency, despite the wide availability of books that articulated it and Ho's public endorsement of it, we focused on the North Vietnamese conventional forces. We consistently sought big battles against those forces. As a result, we virtually ignored the key battle for political credibility and strength essential in this new form of warfare. We were fighting an entirely different war than the Vietnamese. Despite the initial groping by both sides, the Communists had a clear understanding of the nature of the war they were fighting. They had a guide and stuck to it. Even when they misinterpreted the situation and attempted to move to Phase 3 prematurely, not once but twice, they maintained their strategic focus and dropped back to Phase 2. The result was an insurgency that developed mostly as described by Mao. Making use of their secure base area in North Vietnam, protracted war, and continual political propaganda, the Communists changed the correlation of forces between the warring factions and destroyed the political will of the United States. Against both the French and the Americans, the Vietnamese successfully exploited the natural divisiveness of a democracy to erode support for the war. The effectiveness of the North Vietnamese attacks was reinforced by the failure of Western leaders to comprehend what was happening. In both cases, Ho's successful campaign against outside aggression cleared the way for the military victory that constitutes Phase 3 of the Maoist model. In contrast, our strategic decision-makers could not escape their inherent prejudices in their views of war. As Shai and Collier put it, American strategy severely challenged Ho and Jip, but in the end it failed to defeat them, in large part because it never grasped the kind of war being fought nor the particular Vietnamese conditions that gave the war its revolutionary character. 17. Even today, many Americans point to the apparent sudden willingness of the Vietnamese to negotiate after the Christmas bombing offensive as proof that we could have won the war with proper application of conventional forces. This makes sense only if you view negotiation in a Western European sense as a way to end a conflict. In contrast, Mao and the North Vietnamese saw negotiation as simply another tool in the conflict. Mao stated openly that revolutions rarely compromise, compromises are made only to further the strategic design. Negotiation, then, is undertaken for the dual purpose of gaining time to buttress a position, military, political, social, economic, and to wear down, frustrate and harass the opponent. Few, if any essential concessions are to be expected from the revolutionary side, whose aim is only to create conditions that will preserve the unity of the strategic line and guarantee the development of a victorious situation. 18. First France, then the United States, saw superior military power neutralized by the superior political agility of the Vietnamese. The result was a successful execution of a classic insurgency, right down to the final conventional battles and the continued evolution of the fourth generation. Although the Vietnamese strategy was developed only after a long series of mistakes and at great cost, Ho's determined adherence to People's War and his eventual understanding of the strategic situation allowed him to focus his efforts on the real enemy. In doing so, he provided yet another step forward in insurgent theory. He showed insurgents how to defeat the political will of outside sponsor states and refine the concept of changing the correlation of forces. Although this entire chapter may seem an exercise in semantics, its purpose is to stimulate the reader to consider the nature of the war itself. Like most Westerners, we are more comfortable with the European concept of war, with its clearly defined use of force and relatively clear delineation of the responsibilities of the military. Unfortunately, political, demographic, and religious trends since World War II indicate that future wars will be complex, confusing, and nasty for GW struggles rather than the simpler conflicts of earlier generations. During the 30 years of conflict, the Vietnamese communists refined and improved on Mao's doctrine. They showed insurgents how to use a wide variety of information channels to directly attack the will of external powers. These great powers, the United States and France, thought they were protected by oceans from direct enemy action and found out too late that they had misunderstood the nature of the war they were fighting.